Hello. I was just on this panel, or this stage about an hour ago, but I was not the moderator, and now I feel a little drunk with power, so you're gonna have to bear with me. Hi, I'm Sarah. I wrote a book called Work Won't Love You Back, which is, I suppose, why I'm in charge here right now. And I'm here with these two brilliant women who wrote two excellent books about work. Samhita Mukhopadhyay is an old friend of mine, the author of The Myth of Making It and Outdated, and the editor of a collection called Nasty Women that I actually have a piece in, and the former executive editor of both Teen Vogue and Feministing. And Alison Fragale is an organizational psychologist, which is fascinating to me, professor at the University of North Carolina, and the author of Likeable Badass, which is part of what we're here to talk about. So, in reading both of your books, I think both of you are, in a way, trying to acknowledge the reality of the rigged game that the workplace in general is, and that women in particular have to navigate in the workplace, while also noting that the entire game sort of needs to be tossed, trying to give us some advice on how to navigate this whole damn thing. So I wanted to start off by asking each of you to talk a little bit about what motivated you to write about women in the workplace at this particular point, both in maybe your personal life and also the world as it is.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
So, you know, I think the time that I started, made the decision to write a book about work, I was actually working on a different book completely, a memoir about kind of being South Asian in the United States. And my father had just passed away, and I was like going through this whole process of, you know, the extensive Hindu burial rituals. And as I was kind of working on this book, it kind of like wasn't fully coming together. And at the same time, we were going into lockdown. So it's the top of 2020, and I just started to really tap into this conversation I felt like was happening with a lot of the women in my life in terms of how their relationship to work was changing. And it was kind of, you know, the first couple of weeks where everyone was like, oh my God, I'm so relieved I don't have to go to the office. And then the next couple of weeks that were like, I cannot believe I have to like do childcare and work. And then towards the end of the year that were like, I'm giving up on my career, I'm done with all of this. And that kind of happened to me. Like I was the executive editor of Teen Vogue, and the first couple of months, I was like, wee! And then I was like, oh wait, Fashion Week's, like there's no more Fashion Week, there's no more expense accounts, I'm not going to restaurants, and I'm just sitting on Zoom with a bunch of increasingly angry employees, and I don't really want to do this anymore. And so the book is kind of tracking both that broader reckoning and then my personal reckoning and decision to ultimately leave.
Yeah, awesome. In my case, I did not set out to serve women or speak to women. I've been a professor for over 21 years. That was not my childhood dream, but that's where I ended up. And I spoke to audiences that were mainly men. I teach in a business school, and most of my audiences are either business school students or business leaders. But what I found was I spent about 20 years teaching negotiation as one of my topics. And I found that despite the fact that the room would have more men than women in it, the women would constantly come up to me at the podium afterward with a question, often a challenge, something that was happening in their life, often their work life. Their client always wanted to talk to their male boss. They were trying to negotiate for more money or promotion. They weren't getting it, things like that. And so I would just naturally try to help them problem solve with problems that were very imminent. You know, I have a conversation coming up next week. Can you help me think about how to strategize? I said, sure. And so what I started doing was bringing all the behavioral science that I had the privilege of knowing, because it was my job to know it and to conduct it, and to bring that into problem solving with woman after woman. And I realized how much my field had benefited my own career development, because I was just instinctively taking the science of my field day to day and using it to try to navigate my own life as a woman. And I realized I liked doing those two things. I liked taking behavioral science and using it to help women solve immediate types of problems. So a lot of the work that I do, as you mentioned, is about helping women succeed in systems that they're in, because that's a lot of the things that people would ask of me. They'd come up to me and say, okay, I have a conversation next week or a problem right now, and I couldn't say, come back to me when the world isn't biased in the way that it is.
Right.
So I would say, okay, here's what I have that we know from science that we could do. And that really led me down a path of really enjoying that. And now when I decided I was going to write a book, I was very clear when I sold it that two things were non-negotiable. One was that the title had to be Likeable Badass, and they were cool with that. And the other was that it had to be a book for women, which although my editors were cool with that as well, there was definitely an argument to be made that I could have written this book for everybody, but I didn't want to. I wanted to write it for women.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to admit that when I hear Likeable Badass, at first I was like, oh, because it encapsulates the tightrope that I feel like we're walking all the time, right? Of saying, like, I have to tout my own successes, but not too much, because people don't like it when women talk about how they're good at things too much. And any anger or frustration I might feel, I have to say, like, sorry and thank you 5 million times in every email, and asking why they haven't paid me on time for the work that I did 3 months ago, and fun things like that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, like, why it's still our problem to do this damn balancing act.
Well, so what I would say is it's everyone's problem in the sense that the book that I wrote is related to the research that I've done for 20 years, and what that's ultimately about is about the science of status. And status is how much we're respected and regarded by other people. And status is one of a few psychological fundamental needs that all human beings have. So all human beings are going to seek power or control over their life in some way, to seek status, to be respected, to seek affiliation, good relationships, to seek achievement, to be able to get better at stuff. And when we can do those things, life feels better. So status is one of those fundamental human needs that applies to all people, this idea that other people look at us and judge how much they respect and value us. And for some people, they hold characteristics, gender being one of them, that gives them a disadvantage out of the gate because we will assign more respect to one category than to another. So I talk about those ascribed characteristics. But status is ultimately something that is very much affected, and we see this in the science, by how we show up. And so that's what I talk about. So Likeable Badass is not just catchy, it's a reference to how those judgments get made. That when people see you as caring about people other than yourself, and they see you as good at what you do, they respect you. That's an equation that applies to all human beings. And so that's what allows me to feel good about the work that I do. Is I chose to talk about that to women because I know that women have a disadvantage at the starting line they don't deserve. But the way I feel good about it is that those are things that I would counsel every single human being to do, which is how other people respect you is a resource that matters a great deal to your physical, mental health, and your life satisfaction. So you have to think about navigating it. And that just is also true, and particularly true for women.
Yeah, Samhita, you write, the girl boss espouses a feminized hustle. You may be ambitious, but just like a girl, you are neither masculine nor threatening, which again, I think is this similarity between your books. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about the backlash to the girl boss that we've been seeing in recent years, right? Because this is something that is real.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of like contextualize this, you know, the girl boss, because one of the things I've really learned through publishing this book is not everybody has read all of these takedowns on the girl boss. It really kind of was a media story in a lot of ways.
Yeah, exactly.
But girl boss is kind of, you know, this concept that was popularized in this 2011 book, I think, by Sofia Amoruso, where she basically, it's a memoir, and it's kind of, you know, her experience starting her business and how, you know, she became a girl boss. And it became not just, you know, the book, but it became this movement where people were kind of embracing the hashtag and were calling themselves girl bosses. And it was kind of this like millennial pink, like kind of rebranding of Lean In, but to be more accessible and to be a little bit, you know, more kind of fun. And so in kind of this time when I started reporting this book, there was this kind of backlash to this moment of girl bosses, right? You have this like push for women-led businesses, women entrepreneurs, and you know, there was a lot of funding going towards some of these women-led businesses, and come to find out, similar to most startups, there was a lot of toxic dynamics that were proliferating in these businesses, right? Whether they be, you know, poor HR management decisions, or, you know, unequal treatment of employees of color, like some pretty questionable labor issues started to come out, which, you know, if you read them next to what happens in regular startups, we're not really that out of the box, but it was just this moment where, well, it was packaged as like, women leaders were going to change capitalism. They were going to make everything equitable. And everyone was like, oh, but they didn't do it. They didn't solve the problem. And so now we're going to completely destroy them. And that's what they did, right? One by one. You had article after article kind of really like going into a lot of these toxic dynamics. And what I really try to chart out in the book is where and why the concept of girl boss was necessary, and really thinking about young women and how they really kind of benefit from these, or they really buy into these narratives around hustle culture, because that's something you can control, right? Like talking about the broader systemic discrimination you face in the workplace is a lot harder to be like, and that's why I can't get ahead. It's much easier to be like, if I get the right day planner and the right Tupperware set and the right, like I will, and I get to the right Soul Cycle class, like I'm going to girl boss my life. And so we are in this moment right now where I think that there's been this kind of rejection of it. And I think the bigger question that I'm really interested in is like, well, what comes after the girl boss? Because sometimes it feels like when we criticize these things, we're also just shitting on ambitious women. And so where do we kind of go?
Yeah, and to follow up, you write, somewhere early in the book, you mention a sort of tale of two women of the modern era, which was at first the working woman and the comparatively more affluent stay-at-home woman, as in the working woman was not the boss, but was probably cleaning the house of the boss. And yeah, so I'd love to take a minute to talk a little bit about how our ideas of who a working woman is changed from the person who has always been working, right, to the affluent and possibly most likely white woman who has it all.
Absolutely, yeah. And part of where this story comes together for me was the story of my mother, who was a working class immigrant who kind of technically had it all, but would never be the kind of person that was considered the feminist ideal of what it meant to have it all, right? Which is a certain type of affluence. And, a lot of what we understand today as workplace feminism came out of the late 60s with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, right? And this, kind of meditation on the educated woman who ended up as a housewife and all of her discontents, and so her desire to go into the workplace. And, absolutely a legitimate concern, but as, who is the historian?
Alice Kessler Harris.
Alice Kessler Harris, a book that Sarah put on my radar, about women who have always worked, that there's always been women that have had to work, right? There was, in many different, especially, based on immigration status or ethnic background, but also class background, the stay-at-home mom was not actually the most dominant experience. And many working class women would have loved to be stay-at-home mothers, right? And so you have this kind of model of who is the working woman? It's this affluent woman who can afford a nanny and can afford someone to clean her house and can then go into the workplace to find success in the workplace. And so my interest was really in what do we mean when we say, what is the cost of women kind of getting to enter the workplace, and why do we not kind of similarly understand, respect, and really, in many ways, see this as the path forward of the women that have kind of been working all along, managing their families, managing all of the different things that come in their community, their religious community, all of these things that are not considered aspirational the same way as the kind of affluent woman going into the workplace.
Yeah. I mean, and to return to Alison, you write about power and status and how these are two different things that influence each other, and that particularly we can influence our power by influencing our status, but also that, some of your examples in the book are people who kind of had to change the audience in order to be able to change their status. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the difference between power and status and the sort of challenges of trying to change one by changing the other.
Yeah, so status, as I said, is how much other people respect and regard us, and it's critically important, as I said, to our life satisfaction, but it's a judgment that only exists in other people's brains. So you only have as much status as other people think you do. You can't steal it, you can't hoard it. It has to be voluntarily given. Power is controlling resources that people value. So I have 3 kids. My oldest is going to be 16 in a few weeks. If I hold the car keys, that's a resource, right? And so it's you want the car? Well, guess what? You got to do what I want. In the workplace, you would think about things like, I can spend the budget without getting people's approval. I can make a decision without having to get it cleared. I can hire or fire. I can give you a good performance review or a bad one. Those kind of things would be power at work. And so those things are are really important. Power, as I said, is a fundamental human need, but they're different. And a lot of my research has been focused on what happens when you have one but not the other. And there's a couple of challenges for women. First is that we've spent a lot of time talking about two very, very large power problems for women for a very long time, which is pay equity and representation equity, promotions. And those are problems, but they're examples of power. And what we know from the science is that resources follow respect. So if you are trying to get more resources, if you're trying to be in charge of something or in control of something, generally you're not stealing it. Someone else is deciding that they're going to give it to you. And when that happens and that person makes that decision, they're generally not going to do it, nor would you, if you're looking at a person and you're thinking, I don't really respect them. So no, I'm not going to put them in charge of anything. So what I talk about is the fact that power and status, although equally important to our life satisfaction, we've shined a big spotlight on status, and we hadn't been talking about, we shined a big spotlight on power. We hadn't been talking about status as much. Katty Kay and Claire Shipman, who wrote the Confidence Code, they wrote the Power Code. In that Power Code book, they describe status as power's like underrated, unpopular cousin, which I think is fair. And when I went to write Likeable Badass, the full title is Likeable Badass, How Women Get the Success They Deserve. Likeable Badass was never in dispute, but the subtitle went about 733 rounds of negotiation, so much so that I thought the entire book, once already written, was never going to see the light of day because we couldn't agree on the subtitle. But the subtitle I wanted was How Women Win the Status Game, and I was really proud of my title. And the editor was like, Likeable Badass, yes. Status Game, no. I said, it's a great title. She said, no, it's a terrible title because no one understands what status is, which is what makes the book interesting. But you cannot put words on covers of books that people don't understand. It's a terrible way to sell books. So I accepted that, but I did think it was really interesting that no one thinks that these other fundamental needs like affiliation, achievement, and power are mysteries, and yet we have status as a mystery. So that's one of the big distinctions. The other thing I'll say about it is that in terms of the work on what happens when you have one versus the other, it turns out that being a low status power holder is a recipe for misery. So when people have power and they're not really respected, people treat them very badly. And so I've documented that in my research. And that explains why you can see in the workforce some stats that seem perplexing, like senior women leave organizations at higher rates than junior women, and they leave organizations at higher rates than they're promoted, which seems somewhat surprising because you think, aren't those the ones that made it? Yeah. And on some level, yes, but if they have power and they still don't have the respect of an audience, maybe not an old audience that promoted them, but maybe a new audience that they have to influence, they can wake up one day and find out that they're treated worse than they ever were before and wondering why that's happening. And so I think that's another important distinction between the power and status.
Yeah, it was a really interesting example of you mentioned somewhere that I think women, once promoted, actually can end up more miserable than...
They can. That's not guaranteed.
Not necessarily.
Right, but it's something that could
is
surprise you when you think all of a sudden, wait a second, wasn't my life supposed to get easier once I got all this power? And, for some, yes, for some, no.
Yeah. So Arlie Russell Hochschild in The Managed Heart defines emotional labor as the work we do to manage our own emotions on the job in order to produce a particular emotion in someone else, right? This is common on the internet these days, but I like to give credit and actually define it. And that emotion you might be trying to produce in a customer or your boss or your coworker or a client or a student or a source if I'm a journalist. The options are endless. But this labor is both definitely gendered and also present in more and more and more of the jobs that take up most of our economy these days. And so, again, I think both of you are writing about this in certain ways. And one of the traps that Hochschild writes about is that we sort of lose ourselves in trying to manage other people's emotions. So this question is kind of for both of you, but how do we maintain our own emotional, what do I actually feel at the end of the day when you're so busy, full of a day full of managing other people's feelings about you?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Again, easy question.
Yeah.
Very simple.
If you have any advice, I'm taking it. I'm open for it. So I think this is something that is very uniquely gendered, right? This expectation that we'll take care of other people. And I've really struggled with this, especially when I'm managing teams. And both that I genuinely believe in creating certain, like I think historically what's considered boundaries and the way that you should be an effective leader and when and where you should talk about emotion. Like, I don't know if any of you have managed like younger people, but that is like not like an effective tactic anymore. And so, and also just in general, like I think as we bring more of ourselves and the line between professional and personal has blurred with people working from home and things, you know, all of these things that have kind of made the workplace a little bit more casual than like the one that I grew up in. And that has, I think, in a lot of ways made boundaries even harder, right? And so I often feel that like when I'm managing a team or, you know, even my boss's emotions or whatever type of workplace I'm trying to navigate, is that I am not just responsible for the work, but also how the person's going to receive the work and how they're going to be able to do the work and how they're, you know, all of the barriers that are in their way, and that I take like a very proactive role in removing the barriers. But then when they come in and they're like, I went through a breakup, and you're like, that's not a barrier I can remove. Like, I don't know how to manage that one. Like, you know, and I see myself being, I'm like, am I really that like old person now that's like, don't tell me about your personal life, please. But like, I am, because it becomes another thing that I need to own and manage and figure out. And, you know, and if I'm the kind of boss, you know, as if I'm not the likable badass, if I'm just the badass, like there's a consequence to it, right? And so, you know, that constant like, you know, and so I think the easy answer for this is always like, oh, we'll have boundaries. And I'm like, well, that's just so much harder than the reality of these kinds of complex workplaces that we're negotiating and all of these different emotions and this moment where like everyone's so angry about work right now and everyone is so angry at management. And, you know, you have this like constant push and pull. But the way that I do actually do it is to say that like there are things that I can solve and that we can solve together, and then there's things that I can't. And being really clear about that, and also giving myself space to feel my feelings and say like, you know, instead of, I coming up in my career, I was very much like, I'm just so happy to be here. Thank you. Whatever you say, I'll do it. Like, thank you, you know, and I have a reputation for being really easy to work with. And when I reflect on that, I'm like, oh, and that's why you've been able to give me so much work that's beyond my job description. And I did all of it. And, you know, and now I'm at a point in my career where I don't have to do anything if I don't want to, right? And so I can assert a level of power that I've never been able to before. And I think that that's like part of this push and pull. It's less about boundaries and more a real clarity on like, what is your job? What are the limits of what you can do? And like, what is like ruthlessly prioritize what you can and not what you can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm building on that. I mean, emotional labor, we know from all the research, it's very exhausting. So to have to express a set of emotions that you don't always feel. So if you're in customer service, it's like a very prototypical example, and you're like, yeah, the customer is always right. And it's like, but you're mean and you're wrong, and I have to keep smiling, and I'm drained at the end of the day. We know that how tiring that is in jobs. And I think the leap to thinking about that as likable badass is, and I get a version of this question is me showing up as a likable badass to the world a form of emotional labor? And so it certainly could be if you have to represent things that you don't feel. But what I try to do is help people claim their authenticity in that process. So, you know, what I say is likable badass is just a catchy reference to communicating to your audience that you care and that you're capable. That's all it is. And I always say to people, if you don't care about anyone but yourself and you're not good at anything, I can't help you. And yes, it will feel like a lot of emotional labor to act like those two things are true. But I'm going to presume you do care about some people and you're good at something. And then all you got to figure out is, how are you going to show it? And there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. So that's one of the things that I talk about a lot in the book, is that authentic and strategic are often pinned as opposites, and they're not at all opposites. You can be both. So when you find ways to convey to the world, other people, that you care about them, and to convey that you know what you're doing, that are aligned with your authentic self, it starts to feel very much like how you want to live and not a form of emotional labor. But I think that the key is finding it. So an example I always use is smiling, which is a nonverbal signal of warmth. It is. I'm not a very good smiler. I've been asked since I was a child, people would always come up to me, even strangers, and they'd say, what's wrong? And I would say, why would you be asking me what's wrong? And they say, I don't know, you have a look on your face. And I didn't really understand what that meant. And then years later, when the term resting bitch face was coined, in an article, which I think was in the New York Times, but I might be misquoting the publication, but nevertheless, I received from a very, very well-known academic an email a good friend of mine, an email that had the article in it. It had no text in it. It just had the link to the article.
Rude.
And I opened it, and I'm like, oh, this is kind of interesting, but why did he send me this? And all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, I have resting bitch face. Now you tell me. So I found that whole term very, very helpful because I felt like, I could just say, hey, it's not my fault. But it's all to say that smiling, which is a good signal if I care about other people, isn't something I do naturally all that well. I have a mean look on my face half the time without knowing it. But I still feel like I am able to come across to people that I do care by doing other things that I am good at doing. Yeah. So that to me, if you told me, Alison, you need to smile more all the time, that would be emotional labor that would just drive me out of this, like into isolation very, very quickly. So I think that's how you can bridge that gap, is finding the authentic ways to do the thing.
That's so fun. I just want to build on that. Yeah. I am like such a smiler, and it's like to the point where it's like I'm like in like the most inappropriate times, and it's like some kind of nervous response. And so people assume that I'm like more accessible and like I'm gonna be more flexible than I actually am. And then they are like later they'll be like, she's actually pretty tough, and I wasn't expecting it because I'm like such a over smiler.
I love that. Okay, so now on to a depressing question. So all of the tech dudes, and including sort of Mark Zuckerberg, famous hirer of Sheryl Sandberg and inflictor of her on all of us, and of course Elon Musk with his chainsaw on stage, are now embracing the need for masculinity in the workplace and are following Donald Trump and Peter Thiel down the very sexist rabbit hole. And so I'm wondering, maybe Samhita, I'll throw this to you first, because I'm wondering if this is an extension of the backlash to the girl boss, but what do we do in this moment where this is the new normal, apparently?
Yeah, I do. I think that definitely partially it's a response to the girl boss, but I think more it's, to DEI and in general, the idea of women and people of color in leadership roles, which, by the way, is statistically really insignificant still. So the backlash is almost like a backlash to something that's not even been particularly effective. Yeah. And, has long had problems being implemented or successfully sustaining women in, top leadership roles for many of the reasons that we've already talked about. So I think it's almost a reinscription of something that already exists, just they're kind of saying the quiet part out loud, where, we had, because, when you think about it, I think, was it 10 years ago now that Ellen Pao, kind of sued Kleiner Perkins, the VC fund, to say that, she had been left out of the culture of this kind of VC bro, that she wasn't invited to the ski trips, she wasn't, and this kind of moment where the last 10 years we had this like real reckoning of like, wow, the absolute lack of women in leadership in Silicon Valley has had profound consequences on the culture of these organizations and the ethics of these organizations, and also just, the way that the businesses are run and their success. And, so things hadn't really changed that much.
Right.
And I feel like this backlash is almost like a media moment to be like, forget that women's lib stuff. Like, we're here to be, and, just people that are literally angry that they had to think about their privilege in any capacity at all, and the kind of rejection of that. It's like, Mark Zuckerberg's never had a hard time raising capital, or he's never faced any of these things that he thinks he's faced, or he's never been emasculated, for Christ's sake. We didn't do that to him, So it really is this, to me, I think it's just a reinscription of something that's they're just saying the quiet part out loud. Yeah. They were already feeling this way, now they just feel permission to be we didn't want women in leadership roles anyway.
Yeah.
That wasn't a solution. That was just explaining what was happening.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think it's licensing people to say what they wanted to say all along, not changing people's views. On the glass is half full, what I will say is that, we're ending March right now. And when you write a book for women, turns out you become really popular in Women's History Month. And I was curious, would I be popular in Women's History Month 2025? And the answer was, yeah. I could have sold every day to speak at a conference or event 3 times over for the entire month. So there were a lot of organizations out there doing things. And some of the really thoughtful ones who were saying, we're using this bad PR cycle as an opportunity to re-examine programming, which we might have had in place for a pretty long time. And in the adult education space, I would say, like, all of those things do get stale after a while if you don't take a look at them and say, what are we doing? Whether that's an MBA or whether that's some kind of programming in an organization. So I think the organizations who do have a really long-standing commitment are just saying, okay, let's take a pause, let's think about what we really want to do, but we're still here and we're still doing it. And I think the other thing I would say about it that makes me feel, hopeful is that individual action matters a lot. So if we look at the science of what makes people love their job, it turns out, right, if you work for a great organization and you have a terrible boss, you hate your job. And if you work for an organization with a terrible culture and you have a great boss, you love your job. And what I take from that is, like, individual local environments matter a lot, and that we each create a local environment. And so we have a lot more influence than we think over other people. And if we get up and that matters to us, then that still is a really important way that individuals can drive meaningful change.
Yeah. So we've got this big, scary clock staring at, like, ticking down the seconds in front of me, and I keep looking at it and looking at my notes and looking at it and looking at my notes, and going, what do I want to ask you all next? Because we've only got 12 minutes and 51 seconds. And yeah, I think I wanted to, so Gen Z, right? I don't see that many students in the crowd, but maybe we've got some, has been noted to have a very different attitude towards work than perhaps, I'm technically Gen X, but, millennials and whatnot, and the ubiquitous meme of, like, I do not dream of labor, which I love, of course. And I've argued elsewhere that this is a recognition of the reality that work is getting worse, not just, like, young people being lazy. So given worsening conditions in all of these different ways, in everything from paychecks to the destruction of DEI, what is some new advice for now that, we've been looking at? All of us are researchers in different ways, looking at the past 40 years, but, like, it's increasingly likely that the next 40 years are going to be a whole confusing mess. So looking out at everything that's changing right now, like, what is some advice for young people who are looking at the whole world of work and going, this isn't going to serve me, period?
Yeah.
Sorry. Because I get asked this question a lot, and I struggle with it. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, there is no easy answer. I guess I would say a couple of things. I think when I worked at Teen Vogue, it was really a time when I think Gen Z was coming into consciousness around labor, and we're being very vocal about it. I think there's also, different sections of Gen Z. Not everybody is, like, checking out, right? I think that there are a lot of people that don't have the choice, they don't have the ability, they, have to enter the workforce wherever, they can, and are trying to figure it out. I think that the hardest thing right now is we are being told that you could literally do anything you want, but then those opportunities aren't actually there. Even if, like, the jobs report is like, oh, however many more jobs were added, like, for the average young person right now, as they look out into the work world, they are not feeling particularly excited about what is in front of them, from just the young people that I talk to, and feeling very defeated and very that it's, and I do think some of that is this pressure that we've put on. It is kind of the girl boss pressure. It's to say you have to have it all figured out by the time you're 22. And
22, 18.
19, no, literally. I just went through the process of figuring out high school for my 13-year-old stepchild, and in New York City, you have to, like, know what you want to major in by 13. Like, it's, it's just getting younger and younger, right? So I think I think one of the things that we got as Gen Xers that I feel really grateful for is, like, you get a period of time where you kind of just mess around. Like, I did AmeriCorps, I volunteered on a boat, like, I did all of these different things in my 20s that then I didn't get my first job in media until I was 37. Like, I had a really long career before that, and kind of learning and figuring out all of the different ways that I wanted to work. And I think right now, especially, one of the really exciting trends is, the one that gets a lot of coverage is the, like, Gen Z doesn't want to go to the office, which is fine. I think that they're very comfortable in, like, technology and in those spaces. I prefer having time in person, because I think it's really important and like to build humanity and all of that. But a lot of them want to work in issues that are going to make the world a better place, and that's exciting. I think it's a really exciting trend, and it's like really hard to kind of like get paid work doing that right away. And so really giving yourself the opportunity to say like, let me try a couple of different things. I don't have to be perfect at it. It doesn't have to be the end all be all. It doesn't have to be the ultimate solution. I will tell you, at least 10 years of my career was figuring out what I didn't want to do, right? Until I could figure out what I did want to do. And so I think that's a big piece of it. I think from a management perspective, yeah, it's true. I have never in my life thought that it was possible for someone who reported to me to just say no, flat out no to me. I was like, whoa, I've never tried that. And it's like, it's inspiring, but it's also like,
How dare you?
Sarah and I talk about this all the time, because we're like, we will criticize a girl boss to death, and her and I cannot stop working. And one of the things that I've really tried to express in like putting this book out is the solution isn't to give up and stop working. And anything you want to do, like there can also be excitement that comes from like when I worked in a magazine, like those 24 hours that lead up to launching an issue are some of the most exciting, right? It's all hands on deck, you're all creative, you're firing on all cylinders, and that can be a really exciting experience that like if you were just like, I don't want to work like that, you may not be able to participate in that, but then you also wouldn't be able to participate in this great moment, right? Yeah. And so like really figuring out that like sometimes like you are going to have to work really hard, sometimes you are going to have to do things if you're passionate about it, but also they can't be the end all be all, and that's really a lesson for my generation, to be like, we can't work ourselves to death, and we do need those like ebbs and flows. And I have found the younger generation is like really inspiring and helping me figure that out for myself. Because the first time someone came to me with a mental health day, I was like, but I've had a mental health life. Like, what are you talking about? But then I was like, wait, maybe that's not great. Maybe I should have been like paying attention to my mental health as I was coming up in my career. And that has been like really instructive for me to like be more open about that. So
Totally.
Yeah.
I think about it because I come from the space of negotiation, and I think about these generational differences as things to be negotiated, just like anything else, no different. Like the employment relationship is a negotiation, just like buying a car. Yeah. And I do think human beings are very egocentric, right? So whether it's the way you load the dishwasher or the way you've managed your career, you're like, my way is the good way, and the people who do it the different way are the crazy people, and we need to make everyone more like me. But think about it. I think about my parents, who I think would be considered very squarely boomers, and this didn't describe either of them as individuals, but certainly as a generation, they had a relationship to work that would look very different than what Xers would have, which was you expect your employer to kind of take care of you, and you would go there and you would work there from the age of 20 until you retired at 65, and you had a 45-year relationship with that employer, whereas Gen X didn't feel that way. We were like, we will work really hard for you, but if I can go work, make more or do something better, leaving you in 5 years and going to do that, I would do it, and we wouldn't see it as a betrayal. So I do think things change. But in terms of negotiation, I always say, like, bad negotiators, you have to think who has the leverage, and you have leverage when you have things that other people want. If you don't have anything that somebody wants, then you don't have a lot of power over them. So why do people say no to you? Because they might say, there's nothing you're offering me that I really value. And you don't get very far telling people what they should want. Right? And that doesn't work when people tell you. You go to buy a car and like, you should really love this feature. And you're like, I just want a heated steering wheel and some heated seats. Like, I don't care about the engine size. I'm here for the steering wheel. So we can't tell people what they want. I always say, as a good negotiator, you gotta like figure out what your audience wants and then decide, can I and will I give that to them or won't I? And so if you can understand your audience and say, it's not for me to tell you, but to say, if I understand your priorities, can I create an environment that gives you more of what you want? If so, then I will have leverage because you will see my offer as better than what you can get in your alternatives. And I think if we approach the generational negotiation with that lens of negotiation, it gives us more effectiveness, I think, than the my way is the better way, and trying to lecture you on how you would be better if you did it my way.
I'm looking at the clock, and it's 5 minutes, and I'm like, oh crap, can we squeeze in one more question? We gotta squeeze it in a little short thing. But I have a big one that I wanted to end with, which is, Samhita, you use this term, your margin of maneuverability, which is a space between working the job to pay the bills and actually doing the political work of trying to change conditions for all women. And I'm wondering, again, huge question to end with in 4 minutes, how the current political moment sort of changes how we think about the margin of maneuverability.
Ooh. God,
In 2
Sarah.
minutes.
Thought you were going to give me a softball one. Not
Sorry.
that.
You wrote it.
I mean, the margin of maneuverability, it's this Canadian philosopher, Brian Masumi, and it's this idea of like basically finding hope, right? That it's very easy often to say, these are all of the things that are barriers to me being successful at whatever it is that I'm working on. And not taking the time to be like, but where is that glimmer of hope? Where is that piece, that margin of maneuverability where I can do something? And that was really like what I wanted to kind of get across in the book, that despite the fact that we are constantly facing all of these institutional biases and discrimination and family issues and emotional traumas and all of these things in the workplace, there is still actually hope for us and how to find that hope. And I think that even though it's hard, like we have to continue to do it in this moment. And it's not something that's like every day or every moment, or there's many moments where like it doesn't feel that way, but I think there is always like a meeting that you can go to. There is always a book to read. There is always some friend to text. There is always some movement that can happen in your own circle. And, you know, that will be the key to the unlock to like the bigger kind of systemic solution.
So yeah, I think we did ask, how did we feel about it? Now, what I'd say is, like, everything is a phase. So, like, one of the things is I sold my book in 2021 when women were very much still reeling from the, like, I'm supposed to do my job on Zoom while I'm homeschooling my kids and all this stuff. And I had 3 kids. My youngest was 4 at the time. And there was, of the people who were not interested in the book, that give you feedback, which is not many. I mean, there's lots of people who aren't interested, but only very small of them give you feedback. It was this, don't give women more things to put on their to-do list. That was kind of a bit of a feedback. But now, I think if you tried to sell a book about women today, you would get a very different set of resistance and feedback based on what's happening in this narrative. And so what that says to me is that COVID was not that long ago, like 3 or 4 years from now, there will be another story. I don't exactly know what it is, but I don't think that this is forever in the same way that experience of women feeling completely burdened and underwater because of a pandemic was their psychology forever. So, you know, I think that pendulums swing, and it will swing again.
All right. We definitely don't have time for one more question. So let me just say again, thank you to Alison and Samhita and to all of you for being here, and to the New Orleans Book Festival for having us.
Thank you.